In these days, we've come to understand a good deal about contracts, employment and property. And some of that background might be helpful as we read something of a New Testament context in one of the parables of Jesus, in Matthew chapter 20, the parable of the workers and the vineyard. Matthew 20, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, 'You also go out and work in my vineyard, and I'll pay you whatever is right.' So they went. He went out again about noon, and about 3 in the afternoon did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, 'Why have you been standing around all day doing nothing?' 'Because no one has hired us,' they answered. He said to them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first.' The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came, and each received a denarius. So when those who were hired first came, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. 'These who were hired last worked only 1 hour,' they said, 'and you've made them equal to us, who've borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day.' But he answered one of them and said, 'Am I not being unfair to you?' said the friend. 'Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who's hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I'm generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last.'" Now, in this parable, it reminds me of a really true story of how it used to be back in the country that I came from, in North Yorkshire, where in town centres, farmers would go and at different times of the day would try to get people and employ them. But the twist in this story of Jesus, and there often is in a parable, one overriding message, and it surely is generosity here, is that he hired people at different times of the day. There were informal contracts, we might call it. And the agreement was to work for the usual daily wage, which was a denarius. That's what the significance of that is. Those taken on later in the day would be told they would be paid fairly. Now, the workers employed later in the day were engaged on the basis of trust. However, when the day's work was ended, they too were paid a denarius. Now, you can well understand, shall I call it the unease or even anger of those who'd worked all day and received exactly the same. Now, we can relate to God through trust or by contract. You can choose either way as the way you understand life. The nature of faith is built upon receiving what we do not deserve. That's the nature of grace. And that's why this parable, to me, though sometimes described as one of the most difficult to understand, is probably one of the most straightforward and unpalatable to many people who hear it and say, well, surely we've done so much that we deserve this. The world rewards her winners, and generally those who excel. But with Jesus Christ, losers can be winners. Those who are last through the door can be the first in the kingdom of God. It's always been challenging, and I think as challenging to religious people as any. This is the message of the kingdom of God, the message that powerfully hits you between the eye. We've been talking about art a moment or two ago, and sometimes art can take you aback. You suddenly see something that you never saw until you looked at it in this particular light or from this angle. Well, when you hear a story like this, you can't help but feel here is a message that is so powerful for all those that would hear it and would receive with power the message of Jesus Christ. His love is for all. It's grace. Grace we might call is undeserved merit, is that which God gives to people, not because they've earned it, but because he's chosen to give it. So the person at the beginning of the day got exactly what they agreed to work for. The one that came in at the end got what was described as fair. That's the debate. That's the argument. Fair. I think when you've got children, if you've ever had teenagers, I think one of the most powerful moments in life is when the teenager looks at dad or mum and says, but it ain't fair. And you really have to have a conversation about what fairness is, because fairness is very difficult. But fairness with Jesus Christ relates to goodness, his goodness that reaches out. And in the work that we do at Wesley Mission, and I'm very proud to be associated with, fairness reaches out to people who are on the margins, the homeless, the hurt, the damaged, those people who are feeling cut off from the rest of society, who feel unmerited and unrecognized. Thankfully, Jesus Christ, in him, losers can be winners.